All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got Chapter 16, Section 3, Encounters with Europe, 1450 to 1550. So in the previous sections, 16-1 and 16-2, we focused primarily on European maritime, which means by water, expansion, and learned that it was the countries of Portugal and Spain, which were really the first two European nations to have very consequential exploration overseas. So this chapter, Encounters with Europe, looks at the different ways that Portugal and Spain interacted around the globe as a result of this European age of exploration. The first place that we want to focus on, or that we're going to look at, is Western Africa, which was primarily dominated by Portugal. Recall that the Gold Coast of Western Africa was an area in which the Portuguese were especially active in trade. So you might just say the Gold Coast is an active trading area in Africa. Right, specifically Western Africa. If we were to draw a map, this is a very bad map of Africa. The Gold Coast is kind of in this region right here. Portugal would be located, this country right here in the Mediterranean. And you have the rest of the Mediterranean Ocean that kind of fills in this way. So that would be the, actually let's do this. Gold Coast, we'll draw it in yellow. The Portuguese, because they could find a much easier trade route, or a much easier way, a much more efficient way to the Gold Coast than traders historically, there was a strong desire by people in Western Africa to trade with the Portuguese because they could simply bring more goods and offer better prices. Historically, trade had come to Western Africa across the Sahara Desert. That took a very long time. It was difficult to get a lot of goods on the back of camels, which were used across the Sahara Desert. Rather, the Portuguese could just sail and arrive a lot quicker. They could bring a lot more goods. And so many of the kingdoms and tribes in Western Africa along the Gold Coast were eager to trade with Portugal. The Portuguese were successful in establishing trading posts along the Gold Coast. Sometimes these are called factories. One important one was the Portuguese trading post of Elmina, in which the Portuguese later on built a castle. So we'll call this a Portuguese trading post, right, which is what it was. There was some variation in the way that certain states and kingdoms interacted with Portugal in Western Africa. One is Benin. So Benin is an African kingdom. It's also a city, so it's the name of the capital city of the kingdom itself. And in Benin, the Beninese, or the people of Benin, provide Portugal with ivory and prisoners of war that later on would be sold as slaves by Portugal. So these were the goods Benin provided. And in return, what the Portuguese brought included copper, horses, Christianity, of course, because there is a desire to spread Christianity by the Portuguese, who are Catholics. We might say, missionaries who wanted to spread the word of God. And of course, guns, which were in high demand. So all these things were brought by Portugal. And that was the trade that developed in Western Africa between the Portuguese and Africa in that particular area. However, Benin did put some restrictions on Portugal. So this proves that at least Benin had some control over Portuguese trade. And specifically, referring back to our time period here, 1450 to 1500, that's an important distinction because as time goes on, power dynamics shift. At least in this particular time period, Benin had enough control to restrict what Portugal could bring in, specifically things like Christian missionaries. However, in the case of Congo, that wasn't the case. Afonso I, he was ruler of Congo. In the Kingdom of Congo, which was a little bit more located in Central Africa, the rulers of Congo and the people of Congo were much more receptive to Christianity, so they converted to Christianity. At least the rulers did. Merchants sometimes would convert to Christianity to get better trade benefits from the Portuguese. But unlike Benin, Congo unsuccessfully tried to restrict the export of slaves. In fact, Afonso I sent a letter to Portugal's king, trying to do just this, trying to reduce the number of slaves that were being sold to Portugal, realizing that it was hurting the Kingdom of Congo itself. Whereas Benin was successful, Congo was unsuccessful in doing so. This bronze statue right here is just one of the commodities that came out of the city or kingdom of Benin. In Eastern Africa, there's a little bit different of a dynamic setup. For the most part, Eastern Africa had been very active in Indian Ocean trade for quite some time. Many of the city-states on Eastern Africa, so if we go back to our map here, Eastern Africa, maybe let's do a different color here. These were the various city-states that were set up along this coast. Most of these city-states were ruled by Muslim or Islamic rulers. We call them, or sometimes they're referred to as the Swahili city-states. Swahili is a language, a mixture of African and Arabic language, which reflected the fact that these were primarily people from Africa, but the ruling class, the merchant class, were often converted to Islam and spoke Arabic, as that was the language of trade in the Indian Ocean from 1400 and even before that. And we have to recall that in terms of motives for Portugal, right? You know, one motive is obviously trade and making money, but another motive was crusade. You know, remember the Crusades and the really centuries-long conflict between the Christian world and the Islamic world, and Portugal's interactions with the Muslim or Swahili city-states resulted in war, conflict, and conquest. So that was very common. However, not all kingdoms in Eastern Africa were Islamic. There was the sole and alone Christian Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country that is, or area that's located kind of in this area here. And Ethiopia had been going to war with the Ottoman Turks, which is an Islamic empire. And so in terms of Portugal's interactions with Ethiopia, because they were a Christian nation, Portugal forged an alliance. So we'll say Ethiopia, alliance with Portugal to fight Islamic states / rulers. And it was thanks in part to Portuguese assistance that Ethiopia remained a Christian empire well into, you know, the 1800s and the 1900s for another couple hundred years or so. But where the most money was made for the Portuguese Empire was in the Indian Ocean. And that was really where Portugal made a lot of their money and a lot of progress. I'm going to try and draw just a quick map here so we have a point of reference of the Indian Ocean. So that would be Africa. Here we have the Arabian Peninsula. Goes something like this. That would be India sticking out right there. We'll go up the coast. China. Japan, I think, looks something like this. There's technically 4 islands, but that's only 3. I forgot Vietnam. That's Vietnam right there. And then there's some islands here in the Southeast Asia, countries like Indonesia. So this is a very poor map of what we got here, but we'll go ahead and just work with it. So the Indian Ocean is this body of water here, which up until that point had been dominated by Muslim merchants. But now it's the Portuguese that are very much involved there. The traditional or historical ships that sailed in this particular regions were called dhows, right? So this is a small ship which traded in the Indian Ocean and really stood no chance against the Portuguese ships. The Portuguese ships were much better in terms of their maneuverability, their technology, but most importantly, the fact that the Portuguese used cannon on their ship, which really gave them the upper hand. And, piece by piece and little by little, the Portuguese successfully conquered, a lot of different port cities in the Indian Ocean to establish what we call a trading post empire. So there wasn't a conquest in the sense of large swaths of land that the Portuguese conquered, but they conquered a lot of very important trading cities, which gave them a leg up, especially in regulating who could and could not trade goods along the Indian Ocean. Some of these conquests include, so we'll go ahead and maybe use green to represent Portugal, the Swahili coast, so various cities along the Swahili coast here. It included the city of Goa, which is in Western India. It included Hormuz, which is one of these waterways right here. I want to say this is Hormuz, right? There's a waterway that kind of goes up here, which proves to be a very important and valuable trading location. Malacca, which is in Indonesia, which is also a very important waterway. It essentially is it's the pathway from, or maybe Malacca is right here. Yeah, it's probably more accurate. Malacca is the waterway one must pass if you're trading from China to India, right? It's the quickest way. So that's a very valuable area to conquer. And Macau, which was a trading city in China, somewhere up here, something like that. So you can see littered really throughout the Indian Ocean all the ways in which Portugal was able to take control of these various trading cities. Now, the conquest by Portugal was met with varying responses. Some places rebelled against Portuguese occupation of these trading cities. In some cases, they could be successful in fighting Portugal. In other cases, they were not successful in fighting Portugal. Other areas cooperated with Portugal, which in some cases could be more beneficial, but also could be taken advantage by the Portuguese, which often continued to exert control and influence in these various trading cities. One tactic by the Portuguese, which they would always or frequently do, is to levy taxes on anybody that wanted to trade in the Indian Ocean, and therefore were able to accumulate a massive fortune. Most of the predominant states, including China and India, really weren't interested in fighting for or against Portuguese control of the Indian Ocean. So, for example, the Mughal Empire of India, the Ming, and later on the Qing dynasty of China, really the only empire interested in contesting Portuguese influence was the Ottoman Empire here, which did frequently go to conflict and go to war with Portugal. So this control over the Indian Ocean for the Portuguese Empire really was the cash cow and gave them a lot of power and influence. Here's a depiction. This is actually Vasco da Gama, and an illustration of some of the Portuguese exploits in the Indian Ocean. Now, lastly, we're going to get to the Americas. And again, the Americas refer to North and South America. Here, it is Spain. Recall that the Treaty of Tordesillas, and I'm not sure if that's spelled correctly. Actually, let me go ahead and check it. Cross that out. Tordesillas, right? Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese and allowed Spain essentially free access to the New World without having to worry about Portuguese interference where they established the Spanish Empire. The Americas were occupied by the Amerindians, or otherwise called Native Americans or Indians. I'll likely use these terms interchangeably. We're essentially talking about the same group of people isolated in North and South America for, since the Ice Age. Two features or maybe characteristics of Amerindian or Native American society when compared to civilizations and society of the Old World was, one, the lack of metallurgy or metal technology. So metallurgy is the technology of hard metals. This was a technology that was known to the people in the Old World. It allowed them to build things like steel. So there was metal in the New World, right? Native Americans had gold, silver, I think probably copper as well. But the technology to make, for example, iron into steel wasn't known. And so steel was very strong in terms of building armor and weapons. And that gave really people of the Old World, specifically the Spanish and the Portuguese, a leg up in technology. Isolation, or Native American isolation from the Old World, also led them to be more vulnerable to diseases. So in terms of disease, we'd say the Native Americans had no immunities to deadly disease. The way that the human immune system works is that in order to build up an immunity to a specific disease, one needs to be exposed to it. And so, 10,000 years of isolation from particular diseases that had festered in the Old World for a very long time had made the Native American population very vulnerable to disease. And so the lack of immunity, the lack of metallurgy or steel armor and steel weapons really made people of the New World, North and South America, vulnerable to Spain. One of Spain's first conquests was in the island of Hispaniola, which is the Caribbean. Recall that Columbus had made his voyage to the Caribbean or Caribbean islands, come back to Spain, believed he was in Asia, believed that he was in the Old World still, but other Spaniards realized that wasn't the case. And so what they found was that rather than finding the trade goods of the East, like silk and spices and porcelain and stuff that one wanted from India and Asia, that the Caribbean could provide gold, because gold was known, and slaves. And one of the first groups of Native Americans to feel the wrath of the Spaniards was the Arawak. And that was, we'll call it a tribe on Hispaniola. The Arawak attempted to rebel against Spanish occupation of that island. The Spaniards, in return, conquered the Arawak, killed many of them. Diseases passed on by Spanish people and animals killed a lot of the Arawak, and those who unsuccessfully rebelled were also enslaved. And so this blueprint of finding gold, of capturing people, using them as slaves, really set up the Spanish Empire in a lot of their early conquests. Very ambitious people from Spain sought to enrich themselves through golden slaves. Sometimes a term is used to describe the conquistadors. So conquistadors are Spaniards who go to the New World in search of wealth, right? And what was said about the Spanish Empire was that it was about the 3 G's, which is gold, glory, and God, right? There was a religious element to this as well. Gold is pretty obvious in terms of what's being sought there, riches. God, of course, would be to find converts, converts to the Catholic Church. Spain was a Catholic empire. The two most notorious conquistadors, Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, conquered the 2 largest empires in the New World. Hernan Cortez was governor of Cuba when he heard of immense wealth and riches from the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire was an empire located in Mexico, who was really invested in war and religion. And so the Aztec Empire had for a very long time historically conquered their neighbors. One kind of notorious aspect of Aztec religion was the practice of human sacrifice. So for decades, the Aztecs conquered their neighbors, extracted the wealth and resources from central Mexico, and used the captives from battles to sacrifice to their gods. And so this made the Aztec Empire very vulnerable. In fact, there were a lot of enemies of the Aztec Empire in the region. When Hernan Cortez arrived looking for riches, the Aztecs being the richest empire possibly in all the New World, a lot of Native Americans who had been under the thumb of Aztec rule now want revenge. A good example of this is Malitzin. This is a Native American woman who translated and helped Cortez in his desire for conquest. The ruler of the Aztecs at the time, Montezuma II, so this is the ruler of the Aztecs, the Aztec emperor. You can see Montezuma pictured right here, right? And essentially what occurred was that Montezuma invited Hernan Cortez and his men into the Aztec Empire. Cortez then captured Montezuma. There was a rebellion against Spanish rule. Montezuma, in fact, was killed during the rebellion. Cortez and his men were kicked out. However, Cortez regrouped, gained more Native American allies, and finally in the 1520s was successful in capturing the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. So this is the Aztec capital city, captured by Cortez. And the two most important factors in that conquest, one, like we said before, it was the fact that Cortez had many allies in his army. So we'll just say Indian allies, right? Like Malitzin. And the fact that when Cortez initially occupied the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, that smallpox was introduced, and smallpox killed massive numbers of Aztecs before Cortez finally made that conquest successful. This blueprint for conquest and seeking out quote-unquote golden cities, which essentially the Aztec Empire was, continued to fuel conquistadors in searching for wealth and glory and all those other things. Another very powerful and rich city was the Inca Empire. This was located in South America. The Incan ruler was Atahualpa. So we'll call him the Incan ruler, was just successful in fighting a civil war that was in part sparked off by disease. So before the conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived there, the Inca Empire was already in pretty bad shape, having just been gone through a civil war, and the fact that diseases had already arrived to the Inca Empire before Francisco Pizarro got there. At the Battle of Cajamarca, Pizarro captured Atahualpa, extracted the largest ransom in terms of gold and silver, which made Francisco Pizarro very rich. And despite receiving the ransom, as you can see illustrated in this image here, the Spaniards killed Atahualpa regardless. This is Atahualpa right here, and the Spanish conquistadors killing him. So both of these conquests, the Aztecs and the Inca, which were the two most formidable empires in North and South America in the New World, after those two empires were conquered, more or less all of North America was susceptible to Spanish rule, and Spain and the Spanish Empire established one of the largest land empires really in all of world history. Even though the Spanish were the first ones to get out of the gates, to speak, Not long afterwards, there was other challenges by other European powers. The French, the English, the Dutch would all soon arrive and challenge Spanish authority in the New World.